So, this is the 6th lecture on critical physical geography, which is another theoretical framework which can be applied to study river systems, river basins and water. We had already covered socio-hydrology and hydrosocial. So, if you remember that one of the major criticisms of socio-hydrology is that the socio-hydrologists they put lot of emphasis on quantitative modeling. So, they try to do quantitative modeling in a rigorous manner, and that sometimes fails to capture the complex social realities. So, the argument is that the critics argue that this quantitative modeling cannot always capture social realities that are in vogue in river systems, or for that matter in different kinds of water, multiple waters or water bodies. So, while socio-hydrology is criticized due to its sheer emphasis on quantitative modeling, on the other hand one of the major criticisms of hydrosociality, or for that matter political ecology of water, is that in it ecology or the physical and the technical aspects take a backseat. So, within this context critical physical geography, it provides us with an opportunity to strike a balance between both physical aspects and social aspects. So, it is such a field that actually provokes us, or that calls forth for an integration between physical and social aspects, and also between the scientific and the political. So, in that way it is a very radical research framework that the geographers are trying to evolve with. And just before I start the major points that are covered in this lecture, I would just like to say that as it is a very recent and extremely recent conceptualization, so I will not be in a position to to make a detailed closure statements, but I will be in a position to explain what is CPG or critical physical geography, why CPG. So, why it is important for us, or why CPG can be a very significant and vital theoretical framework to understand river systems and water. How critical physical geography, and here I will be able to cite some examples from some of the recent works that had been conducted where the geographers had applied the lens or the methodology of CPG. And finally, I would like to end this lecture with my opinion, or my take on why I think that CPG can be mobilized within the South Asian context, and why it is a very significant tool through which we can also radicalize river research. So, this is the route map for this lecture. Now, to begin with, what is CPG? So, actually geography, the discipline of geography was broadly classified into two major domains. One is physical geography, and the other one is human geography. And unfortunately seldom these two domains used to converse between each other. So, so geography discipline was bifurcated between these two streams or two domains. So, this is what is known as the bipolar syndrome in the discipline of geography. Critical physical geography is the development or the recent development within geography, which says that there should be an integration between physical geography and human geography. So, the both should depend on each other. So, it should be a kind of a mutually interdependent relationship. So, critical physical geography it's a one step ahead, and this is a very vital step which calls for from bipolarity to integration. So, what we find in critical physical geography is that both there should be a lot of emphasis on both the physical and the human geography elements. So, to elaborate on this is that critical physical geography provokes us, or it argues, it sharply points out that there should be whole lot of not only exchange, but also integration. So, there should be whole lot of integration between geomorphology, ecology, biogeography, hydrology, climatology on one hand, and political ecology, STS, that is science and technology studies, environmental history, urban geography on the other. So, what is important in critical physical geography is that there has been a transformation, there has been a so it is a kind of a transformed trajectory from bipolarity to integration. Now, this is a quote from Rebecca Love's paper published in 2014, and this is a very significant remark by Rebecca Love, and it is a very comprehensive argument put forward by Love, who is one of the critical physical geographers of the contemporary times. And Love says that we cannot rely on explanations grounded in physical or critical human geography alone. So, the point that we had just raised in the previous slide, that is there should be a whole lot of integration between the physical aspects and the human geographical aspects. So, she says the same thing, that we cannot rely on either this or that alone. So, these two should not be treated as separate units of analysis, but these two should converge, these two should intermingle and combine, and there should be a whole lot of integration across technical physical aspects and social political aspects and human geographical aspects as well. So, and why this integration is important? So, she tries to explain the reason behind this. So, she says that this integration is important because biophysical landscape are as much the product of unequal power relations, histories of colonialism, racial and gender disparities as they are of hydrology, ecology and climate change. So, this is a very significant comment where she says that landscape. So, when we are looking into a landscape, so for example, a geographer, the way he would look into a landscape would be very different from how an architect would look into a landscape as. So, the way an architect would perceive a landscape would be very different again from someone doing or practicing or pursuing environmental history. So, but today, if we want to come up with solutions, if we want to provide management solutions for a particular landscape that is undergoing some challenges or some risks or whatever, then the argument is we cannot solely rely on the expertise or the skill sets of any particular expert coming from a particular disciplinary background. So, today's era of Anthropocene and the kind of social and environmental changes that we are encountering today, that provoke us to not to provide solutions from only singular units of analysis, but from plural units of analysis. So, this is what Love talks about, that socio-physical landscapes, they are the product of power relations, colonialism, gender disparities, as they are the products of the physical elements like hydrology, ecology and climate change. And Rebecca finally argues that critical physical geography is thus based in the careful integrative work necessary to render this co-production legible. So, co-production, so we had already talked about integration. So, now she is talking about co-production, another sophisticated research term. So, how these methodologies or methods or techniques across these disciplines together can co-produce with co-produce and help us to identify the challenges and potentials associated with particular landscape or waterscapes or other ecosystem resources. Yes. So, now we will discuss about how CPG had actually evolved. So, it is still evolving, of course, it is a very dynamic field right now, it is very recent, as I had already mentioned, and it is definitely in a dynamic way, it is evolving. But then let us do the historiography exercise a little bit, as we had done it for the other lectures as well, for the other theoretical frameworks. So, now if we try to sketch the trajectory or the journey of CPG, then we will find out that CPG actually finds its precedence in the works of biogeographers. Especially I can just talk about two cases, one famous work, and it is cited in the reference section by Thomas Weil, and the other work by William Denevan. So, they are the biogeographers, and Thomas Weil, his path breaking argument was that he said that the goodness, so the goodness, quote unquote goodness, or the quote unquote badness of human alteration of vegetation, if you want to assess, or if you want to evaluate the goodness or badness of human alteration of vegetation, then you will not only find your answers in the ecological effects per se, but you also need to explore the human values, ethics, morality, behavior, and all these elements that play vital role in the alteration of vegetation. So, he talked about human values, he talked about ethics. So, he brought in all these otherwise so called softer elements, and said that these elements are also important for us to evaluate or assess the goodness or badness of human alteration of vegetation. So, this was his argument long back in the 1980s. Then there is another work by William Denevan, and William Denevan, he also critically reread the sources to explore the myth of pristine, so called pristine American wilderness. So, if you are interested, the references, the full references are cited in the reference section. You can just take a look. If not the whole article or the entire work, you can only go through the abstract or the highlights of these major works to get some idea about how the biogeographers already were talking about social science parameters as well. Now, to be more specific, if we want to trace the journey of critical physical geography, it will not be erroneous, it will not be wrong to say that critical physical geography is actually foreshadowed in 3 decades of work in political ecology and environmental history. So, political ecology, we already know political ecology by now, and political ecologists and environmental historians, both these scholars, and I mean who started practicing political ecology and environmental history, they had actually combined rich archival sources, and political ecologists mainly ethnography. So, detailed ethnography, detailed field work they had done, and they had helped us to highlight and to understand things which are otherwise not that much visible. So, for example, there are numerous works by the political ecologists, and these are some fundamental books on political ecology which tells you about what political ecology is all about, the methodology and all that. For example, Paul Robbins' book, these are kind of handbook and all that. So, political ecology, for example, there are very interesting works which show us that for example, if you want to understand African drought, okay, and but if you want to study pastoralist response to the drought, then only technical assessment of that particular physical phenomena would not capture the entire picture. So, you cannot do the research from the UN headquarters, you cannot get the entire view from satellite images. So, what you need to do is that you have to do rigorous and detailed ethnography, field work to capture the regional specificities. So, this is what the political ecologists had made us understand. So, for example, there are very interesting works. For example, I can just remember the work of Zimmerer during the 1990s, where Zimmerer shows that how soil was eroding in Bolivia due to depopulation. So, this kind of an argument it challenges the challenges Malthusian assumption where we only tend to think that if the population increases then only soil fertility will decrease. But Zimmerer has showed through her research, detailed empirical research, that in Bolivia soil erosion or soil fertility soil fertility decrease or soil erosion occurred due to depopulation. So, regional specificities, regional variables are very important components which with which the experts or the scholars need to get accustomed to understand what is actually going on in a particular field. Similarly, environmental history also we have multiple works, we have works by so many historians are there, and in the next couple of lectures we will get to know more about environmental history, more specifically environmental history of South Asia, India, and there you will see that how environmental historians had also combined archival research methodology and field research to come up with ideas which were otherwise quite unexplored so far as changes or degradation of ecosystem resources are concerned. Yeah. So, again another significant remark from Rebecca Love's article or paper. So, where she says that political ecology, environmental history, these are all important fields of analysis. So, more importantly focusing on political ecology, Love says that while it has done a great deal to foreground our, and this is important, always politicized interactions with the biophysical environment, it frequently privileges social processes theories in the explanation of biophysical situations. So, the argument that we had already that I had already made, that one of the recent criticisms of political ecology is that though it is emphasizing a lot on politics, so it is able to make us understand the politicized interactions within the biophysical environment. On the other hand, the problem is that ecology or the physical aspects are actually taking a little backseat in political ecology. So, so the same thing Walker also pointed out in 2005. So, the ecology is rarely an equal partner to the political. So, within this context, critical physical geography is an important framework. Why? Because it requires critical human geographers to critical human geographers to understand the role of the physical systems or the importance of material environment in shaping social systems. On the other hand, it also engages physical geographers and engages physical geographers and make them expose to social systems, to power relations and human practices, and the physical geographers, they tend to understand that why and how power relations and human practices actually determine physical systems, and not only physical system, but also their own researches. So, this is why critical physical geography is such a vital tool, it is such an important methodological framework for both the human geographers and also for the physical geographers. So, now I am going to discuss one or two works where these scholars had applied the lens of critical physical geography in order to so they had applied this particular lens so far as river basins or river systems are concerned. There is a wrong citation. It is Stuart Lane's paper which he developed in or which he published in Stuart Lane and his team, they published in 2011. So, it is not 2018. So, you will have this list in the reference section. So, in the list you will have this reference as well. So, there are many works in the recent decades. Stuart Lane and his team from the University of Lausanne and other parts of Europe, they had worked a lot on river system and river science, and more specifically flood science, and they have come up with numerous papers, and I have cited few papers here. So, this particular paper on flood science is by Lane and his team, which was published in 2011. So, Lane and his team, and similarly in the same year Payne and his team, in collaboration with the English Rivers Trust Group, they also came up with a publication in the same year 2011. So, these two works, I mean the contribution of these two works are that of course, they had applied critical physical geography lens or critical physical geography as a methodological framework, and they tried to see that how knowledge about flood risks can be co-produced by both the scientists who have technical expertise in the field and also the so called quote unquote laymen, local laymen, who are either interested about the whole phenomena or who are involved or affected by this change. So, both of them had done the same thing, and for example, R. Payne and his team, as I mentioned, in collaboration with Rivers Trust Group, they had applied what is known as participatory action research. So, this is nothing new. So, we all know what participatory action research is all about. So, what they have done is that they asked the people who are interested, who will be interested in this particular research with them. So, either people who are affected by the change, or people who wanted to get involved in this research. So, they asked these people to participate in this research with them. So, what was the issue all about? The issue was that slurry was getting discharged in a particular river, and due to which the health of the river was deteriorating. So, it will be a fascinating exercise for you if you can really go through this particular paper cited in the list of references. So, we will see that so this particular issue, when the slurry I mean the river's health was deteriorating due to slurry and due to sweat in the liver. So, they try to assess and they try to measure, assess, evaluate the condition of the entire stretch, and they also wanted to do some kind of risk assessment. Okay. So, they asked the affected and the interested people to to get involved in this whole research. So, what the trust members did was that the trust members, they collected the data, they conducted analysis with support from scientists, and they also discussed the implications, and this is very important, discussing the implications of their findings with the larger audience. And this was followed up by planned and implemented follow up action. And so, what was the outcome? The outcome was series of maps of land cover, risk across the catchment, and they could also co-produce a model to identify farm vulnerability, and most interestingly, it allowed locally tailored and politically sensitive solutions to slurry pollution. Because if only the scientists would have been involved in this exercise, then maybe politically sensitive or locally tailored, these two things are very important, locally tailored and politically sensitive. So, what I am trying to argue is that as Payne and his team had shown us that if they would have only involved the scientists and the technocrats for that matter, or only the experts, then or even only the scientists and the policy makers, then they would not be in a position to deliver politically sensitive and locally tailored solutions. So, politically sensitive and locally tailored solutions, they could only they could only come up with to deal with slurry pollution in the river, because they involved affected and interested people in this research, and they gave agency to them. So, this is a very an appropriate example of how participatory action research is done. Yeah. So, again another important aspect. So, these are only very few works that are being conducted very recently, you know, I mean applying the lens of critical physical geography. So, Blue and Brearley 2016, they tried to look into the contribution of critical physical geography to geomorphology. So, how a critical physical geography can actually contribute to geomorphology. So, the argument is like just as the particular river is a product of its valley, similarly geomorphology shapes, and it is also in turn shaped by the world around it. So, this is the major argument. So, for example, Cameron remarked in his 1963 work that not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. So, I can just elaborate this remark by an example, the example of this particular river, the Upper Yellow River in Western China, Dari in Western China. Now, so the argument is that like how can you actually assess or how can you actually measure river geodiversity. So, what are the attributes you actually need to measure in order to assess, you know, river geodiversity, and why would you actually I mean why would you take those parameters and those attributes only. So, these are the things which need to be critically looked into and answered. So, for example, this particular river in Western China, it has a transitional form, like you know, the students or experts from geography, I mean people with I mean coming from the discipline of geography, they will understand that this river actually it has a kind of a transitional form between what is known as the braided form, between what is known as actually the braided and the anabranching morphology. So, this is a transitional form, and why I am giving this example? I am giving this example because generally braided and anabranching morphology, they have different you know process associations. So, it is quite exceptional that they will remain in the same stretch. But here what is happening in case of this particular river, that both this braided and the anabranching form, I mean a transition between these two forms are is available in this particular stretch of a river. So, these kind of rivers, they will actually make us understand, they help us understand the fact that we cannot implement normal so called quote unquote you know normal classification or universal normal classification model across every river. And these transitional form enables us to understand that, you know, we will actually come up with inappropriate management solution if we start having particular expectation from a particular I mean from river characters and behavior. So, that is why different rivers, they have, you know, different attributes, and it is very important for geomorphologists to remain aware about these different attributes. But what I will argue finally is that I mean these are still works in progress, and we need I mean rigorous place-based and democratic understandings of landscape. Yes, this argument has already been established, but more and more empirical investigations need to be carried out because still it lacks detailed methodological and practical analysis, but at least, you know, the framework is evolving well, it is coming up well. And the framework is very dynamic. So, you know, I mean it is an exciting opportunity for all of us to really get plunged into this particular framework. Yes, so just one or two more examples. One particular work by Urban and Rhodes 2003 work, where they tried to study the interplay between human agency and biophysical processes in the agricultural landscape of mid-western United States. This is another fascinating example where Urban and Rhodes they deal with a case study which shows that in this mid-western United States landscape, the farmers they actually wanted sustainable agricultural production. Of course, there were economic imperatives behind that. So, they wanted sustainable agricultural production in the seasonally wet and poorly drained landscape. So, what they did was that they made the extent made the extant streams viable, and they channelized extended drainage channels to the otherwise unchannelized part of the landscape. So, what happened was that we can see here that human beings they became agents of geomorphological change, and the outcome was agricultural homogenization or simplification for that matter, where habitat habitat complexity things attributes associated with habitat complexity, it lost ground, and it also had some impact on the integrity of the fishing communities. So, Rhodes, Urban and Rhodes they argue, they demonstrate that though land drainage might appear to be very simple, and though anthropogenic change might appear straightforward, but it is very important to understand that land drainage also it comprises of lot of social and cultural aspects, and sometimes the identity of the farmers, and not sometimes in most of the cases as these are formed for a long period of time, as these operate for a long period of time, function for a long period of time. So, the farmers their identities are also to a great extent associated with these kind of land drainage systems and techniques and mechanism. So, it is very important for us if we really want to come up with sustainable and viable drainage solutions, then we need to consider these social and cultural aspects across long temporal trajectories. So, this brings me to this, makes me remember of overflow irrigation in Bengal. So, we will cover about we will talk about overflow irrigation in detail when we will be talking about water management practices in eastern India during the ancient time and also during the colonial time, and how actually Bengal's overflow irrigation it was replaced by the colonial perennial irrigation system, and what harm it actually did to the environment and society at large. So, finally, so as I mentioned that it is an ongoing, very recent dynamic field. You can see from the dates. So, this panel, a very exciting panel, re-envisioning sustainable deltas through critical physical geography, that is applying critical physical geography to understand deltas. Okay. So, this a panel it was organized very recently 2018, I think in the month of April, and so it was a panel which was organized in the annual meeting of the American Association of Geographers. We are yet to receive the full papers from this panel, but you can just click this link and go to the concept note. And you will find out that how in the concept note or how in the description it is said that these deltas, these are these are these not only physical landscape, but these deltas are also socially produced landscape. So, this is the major argument that is there in the description, and it's I very much hope that it was a very exciting panel, and we are yet to receive the full papers, but very much hope to receive and read the full paper soon, and so we will be able to understand how critical physical geography can be applied to study deltas, not only in specific deltaic estuarine areas, but across the world, across floodplains, how deltas can be studied, and how deltas can be perceived from the lens of critical physical geography. So, the final slide on how and why I think that mobilizing critical physical geography can be critical physical geography can be mobilized so far as South Asian context is concerned, because South Asia is we already know by now, South Asia is a very huge and it is a complex and it is a diverse context in terms of both physical and socio-political realities and dimensions, because South Asia had encountered colonialism. South Asia, it's a very diverse context, and where we also had these pre-colonial management practices practiced by indigenous communities. So I am not going to elaborate this particular thing right now here, but then when we will be discussing in details the case studies relating to the South Asian context, it will gradually become clear to us. So, these multiple layers will get unveiled and explored, that how critical physical geography might be an imminent necessity to understand to understand environmental change from a broader from a much broader and larger prism or larger frame of analysis. So, another thing is that critical physical geography will also be very important for us to radicalize river research, because we had already mentioned that critical physical geography not only integrates physical and social dimensions, but it also shows us the way how to integrate the scientific with the political, by not only providing scientific solutions, but today in the contemporary times we also need to really come up with and provide politically sensitive solutions, and critical physical geography is an exciting methodological tool that actually shows us a way how to do this, how to pursue this. So, again a quote from Lane that passes from the dark ages to the golden ages of a truer, purer and above all better kind of analysis. So, Lane is very optimistic about this particular frame of analysis, and Lane says that critical physical geography is such an important field that it will enable us to pass from the dark age, the age or the era where segregation was the norm, but not integration. But now from the dark age of segregation, how we can actually move on to a truer, purer and above all better kind of analysis through integration. So, finally, critical physical geography, I am personally very interested in this, and I am also excited about this frame of analysis, because I think it strikes a balance between theory and actions, and it also strikes a balance between the so called analytic and normative, because it not only shows us ways or help us understand and justify how the world is, but it also gives us an understanding about how the world ought to be. So, with this I would just ask you to go with these references, and you can have your budding ideas, and definitely we can exchange a lot. You can come up with your queries, your frame of analysis, criticisms, whatever, and we can have very interesting and integrative interactive exchanges in the online forum. Thank you.